For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
You're on Strat News Global. I'm Nitin Gokhale. Good evening. It's the start of a new week and perhaps an important week for the Indian military when a debate on jointness and integration across the three services, Army, Navy and Air Force, is now out in the public and is being debated vigorously all across the media, think tanks, among the veterans. And that's the topic we are going to discuss this evening with a very eminent panel of veterans who have had an opportunity to work in dry service atmosphere and organizations in one way or the other at the highest levels in the Indian military. I'll shortly introduce the panel. But before that, I just want to go and give a background of the entire discussion that we are planning. And that is not something that I'm going to talk about what General Bipin Rawat said and what the Indian Air Force Chief, Air Chief Marshal R.K.S. Bhaduria said, but I want to take you back 35 years to 1986 when the United States enacted Goldwater-Nichols Act, which forever changed the way Department of Defense and Pentagon, which is Department of Defense, of course, more popularly known as Pentagon, and its military components function and operate. All the specific provisions in the Landmark Act were aimed at solving just one problem, and I want to emphasize on that. The reluctance of the four military components, Army, Navy, Air Force, and the Marine Corps, to operate effectively as a joint team. They just wanted to overcome this reluctance as a bottom line in this 88-page document, which is available on the website of the Library of the Congress. The paper or the act actually says it is devoted to improving jointness, effectiveness, and functioning of the Department of Defense. Now, 35 years later, we are in the similar position in India, where after the creation of the Department of Military Affairs and the appointment of the first Chief of Defense Staff in General Bipin Rawat, Indian government wants to also similarly reorganize the Department of Defense and its military components. Where are we at the moment, and what is the way forward is what we are going to discuss. So let me introduce the panel here. Lieutenant General Satish Dua, formerly retired as the CISC. And now CISC is very complicated to explain to general viewers, so I'm not going to say anything except saying he was head of the Integrated Defense Staff, where all three services work together, plan and budget for all the three services. He was also involved in the initial study for the creation of Department of Military Affairs as well as jointness. Welcome to this program, General Dua, but let me introduce the other two panelists. There is Rear Admiral Sudarshan Srikhande joining us from Goa. He's also worked in the IDS in his one of his assignments and has a fair idea written very extensively on the theaterization, the jointness, integration, and what should be the way forward. In fact, his three-part article for our sister website, bharatshakti.in, in 2019, immediately after the announcement of the creation of the post of CDS. We just republished it this month after the debate was reignited, and a very thorough and well-researched articles that he had published forms the basis of some of the discussions that we are going to do. And finally, Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, currently with the NDC as the President's Chair of Excellence, and an author of two very important books on India's military history and how the Indian military has fared since 1947 in various operations, how they work together, not work together. So a very informed and completely qualified panel to talk about all this. So let me begin with General Dua about the planning for Department of Military Affairs and the way forward for what is called theatre commands or joint commands. What do you think is the way forward? Is it that there should be a public debate or there should be an internal debate, and which then should be taken to the Parliament before we establish any of the joint commands? What would you think is the correct way as far as India is concerned, General Dua?
Nitin, first off, let me just say that this is a very bold step. It's a very evolutionary defense reform. If we are not reacting to something, true, in a larger sense, we were reacting after Kargil war. That process has taken a long time. And the appointment of CDS has come after 2 decades. So it's a very bold step and long overdue. I'm really glad that the government has taken this step. The forces are now integrating, and in doing so, there is bound to be some churning, and it has happened in every country whenever they integrated. But let us remember that we are all on the same side, and we are all working for the security of the country. How to get a bigger bang for the buck by integrating the 3 services, having joint processes and procedures, and jointness in the services. As to your question as to whether there should be a debate, a national debate, or we should debate it in-house before we go to the Parliament, the short answer to that is that these are security matters of security in terms of talking about national defense and security needs. I dare say that these discussions should be in the closed rooms, in the South Block, in the 3 headquarters, in various academic institutions that of the 3 services, in the think tanks, because the nation at large perhaps will not be fully equipped. There will be individuals who are very interested, qualified, and can add value. That does come. You can't stop that. That debate will go on. But the nitty-gritties will have to be worked out by the experts. And experts in this case are the 3 services, the senior, higher leadership of 3 services, and also, like I mentioned, at different levels, it is being discussed already. Having said that, and I will just make one brief comment, and then we'll take up the issue-wise discussion later. What has happened in the last couple of days, the national discourse became, very vehement, and everybody was discussing these statements given out by the leadership. Now, my point is, it is not a contest. We are all on the same side. There are bound to be differences. And I think Arjun Subramanian was just saying a little while ago, it is good that we are having these discussions, debates before the integration process has actually taken a step forward than later. And I see this as a positive sign.
Well, certainly point well taken. In fact, I want to remind our viewers that the Goldwater Nichols Act, which has been cited by a lot of people now, maybe reading it thoroughly or just doing it cursorily, was enacted after 5 years of debate in the United States and not before. So it's not an easy overnight process. That must be kept in mind. But let me come to Air Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, mainly because the Air Force is right in front and center of the churn and the debate and the controversy because of the public remarks made first by the CDS, General Bipin Rawat, and followed by the Air Chief, who said that we will do it internally. Although he did rebut some of the assertions made by General Bipin Rawat. So, Arjun, over to you as far as the integration and jointness debate is concerned. What should be the way forward? Should India hurry it up? Should it be sort of done in a timeline that has been stipulated by the government, or there should be more time and more discussions? Subramanian.
Yeah, thanks, Nitin. And let me first answer your initial comment to say that the Air Force has been in the thick of the controversy. And the reason is because if you look at the texture or the landscape of theaterization that has been rolled out, into the domain, you will see that this is not so much about a reluctance to integrate or to improve jointness, but it is more an attempt to voice a feeling or a proposition that, look, when you embark on the process of jointness or integration, be mindful of the DNA, the ethos, and the culture of organizations that you are trying to integrate. Now, if you look at the manner in which the theater commands have been laid out, uh, both the Navy and the Army are relatively on a comfortable wicket when it comes to maintenance of the DNA, the ethos, the culture, the structure, the deployments, and the operational employment. But if you look at the Air Force's position, you have a service that is almost 100 years old, which sees that its DNA, culture, and ethos is under threat with the current structure. And therefore, all what it is saying is that please be mindful of this issue when you attempt to penny parcel out assets to all the theater commands. And therefore, in a way, you are actually dismantling the DNA, ethos, and culture of the organization and expecting the service to completely fit into a model that will take some time for it to adjust to. And therefore, integration is non-negotiable. And I have always been saying that so much of effort, energy, and responsibility has been invested in the CDS by the government. The process is non-reversible. So I've got no doubts in my mind that integration and probably theaterization is something that is inevitable. But my argument, which I think I voice the concerns of the Indian Air Force, is that maybe the methodology needs a bit of a tweaking and needs to keep in mind that are you going to sacrifice operational capability and DNA, culture, and ethos for jointness, or are we going to see some way in which one can accommodate DNA, culture, and ethos while integrating?
Fair point. In fact, that is what I think even I have come across in my discussions with Air Force officers, and I think this will be taken on board. I have no doubt about that. But let me turn to Admiral Srikhande, who, as I said, has studied and written extensively on joint commands. He calls them, he would rather call them joint commands rather than theater commands, and I'll let him explain why he says that. Admiral Srikhande, this entire debate, I would think, or the public debate at least, is needless. Your first reaction to that, I'm sure you've had some other platforms where you have voiced your reaction, but here at least, what do you think is happening and what should be the way forward?
Thank you, Nitin. I would say that it has to be a combination. After all, national security issues are out in the open. Serving leadership from time to time has spoken in seminars or to the media about these issues. So, whereas the nitty-gritties, as General Dua was mentioning, have to be resolved in-house, maybe in closed doors, etc. The overall principles do not change. And I think even the principle of jointness is something that we learned without learning the word jointness. Right from the time we were cadets, it was called the principle of cooperation. And in fact, cooperation meant a lot more than jointness itself. It meant across a whole stream of activities. So we should not imagine that jointness itself is something new. It has been enshrined amongst the principles of war and warfare as the principle of cooperation. The second point, taking off from where Air Marshal Subramanya was mentioning, and I would like to offer a little clarification on the issue of supported and supporting force or something like that, and that's important because I think that debate seems to be, or that statement seems to be problematic, as has been seen in the media. And here, even if you look at the issue of supported force, supporting force, etc., in say the U.S. Department of Defense glossary, it is quite clear, and two or three things emerge. That is, for instance, for a tactical objective of the army, say evicting an enemy from a small area or going into a small area to for tactical objectives, in which case air power has always has had very great clarity and commitment, and they call it close air support. So it is a supporting force in that, but it is not a supporting. That means the Indian Air Force is not a supporting service for something else. I mean, that distinction is very important. So it depends whether the objectives are tactical, whether it is in the execution of certain operational objectives and planning, or something like that. In which case, it is fungible. That is, a supporting force becomes a supported force. A supported force can change its roles. So, in other words, I would suggest here that nobody should think that the term supported force or supporting force either denotes anything but a contextual assessment. It is not hierarchical in the sense that one service is superior to the other, or one service is more important or the other, or within a service itself certain things are more important than others in the pecking order. It seems to me that the debate and the counters to it also have focused on this part of the pecking order, and I don't think we should forget the basics of what is a supported force, what is a supporting force. It's very, very contextual. And I think in this case I would also offer, uh, 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 Arjun was mentioning about the DNA of a service, etc. So here sometimes I feel, because the army is so overwhelmingly large in India as compared to the other services, uh, their DNA thinks about some of these things differently from what the Navy thinks, and I can speak with some greater experience of the Navy, in the sense that in the Navy we do not really grow up on a culture of thinking of combat arms and support arms or something like that. Uh, a ship or a submarine is a fighting animal with teeth and tail, everything combined into it. So therefore, and I cannot think of a hunting animal or a predatory fish, a shark or a killer whale or something like that, or a bird of prey where the tail, the feathers, the jaws, the claws do not matter. All of them matter, and that's what makes the whole hunting animal, and that's what each service is, and that is how it comes there. It all adds up together. The second point here, if I could just briefly mention, is what you mentioned about use of the word theater itself. I think the debate has gone into thinking of theaterization as something vastly different from what has existed. And what has existed today are the very simple geographical cardinal and or intercardinal points of commands for each service. Now, each service had effectively a theater. We should, I think, understand, as far as the audience is concerned, that command in say Western Naval Command, or Western Air Command, or the Northern Command for the Army, is a command function. It's a war fighting organization, and the theater connotes now the geography or the and it goes on to considerations of military strategy and geostrategy itself. So fundamentally, all three services were looking at a similar geography with different commands. We're looking at the same theater as three theaters, somehow trying to be one. In this proposed schema now that we have, which has been directed by the government, all theaters will really be commands that are merging into theaters that each service had. It has to be done with greater efficiency, and I agree with the point. I've made that point quite unequivocally of uh, the merits of having a geographically named command instead of a functional prefix somewhere as maritime theater command. Instead of that, I think our forefathers were wiser in having anodyne names for all three services as single commands, as southern, southwestern, eastern, whatever it is, and depending on Navy, Army, Air Force. We are doing that, combining. I would say that rather than uh, having an air defense command, it is important for the Air Force to have something which should simply be called the Central Command, not Central Air Command, where a fair amount of uh, air power is fielded from there, even if not necessarily held in a very much more coordinated manner. And it is nothing that is going to be unique to the Air Force. space issues, cyber issues will also be similarly handled in terms of a central organization which works directly under the CDS thereafter. The Central Air Command, that is the major wielder of air power, will be under the CDS. Thank you.
I think quite a few points that you made here, but I will come back to Marshal Arjun Subramaniam on that. But General Dua, you were involved towards the end of your service in the military, and in fact, probably the drafts were made when you were heading the IDS. The idea is not to split or belittle any of the service, as I understood the concept. What is the uniqueness that India has in terms of geography, its adversaries, that has to have a separate kind of integration model rather than adopting it from the United States or the UK? Just give us some fair idea before we go further on other future topics.
You see, let's take one or two models, one or two other models to be able to compare. The US is an expeditionary sort of service. Their military is more expeditionary in nature. So that doesn't suit our dispensation, our geography, and our national interests or national aims. As far as India is concerned, we have our geography as well as our border issues lend themselves very clearly to having three, we call it theaters or call it integrated commands. We have on one hand one adversary with unresolved borders. On the other hand, we have other adversary with other unresolved borders. And the terrain, the geography of our country also lends itself to having integrated commands in such a manner that we look after, or that command is responsible for one particular adversary in one part of terrain. Similarly, in the south, in the peninsular area, also it lends itself to the geography, lends itself to having a particular integrated command. Now, having said that, our model has to be suited to our requirements, and we do not have to copy either the American model or the British model, which is British model is very, very different. The Chinese model is their own model. So to get back to the point, we need to model our integration as per our needs, and I think in that manner we are progressing in the right direction.
Okay, great. I think that is important to know. I just want to, before I come to Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, I want to sort of read out from the original press release issued by the government at the appointment of the announcement of the appointment of the CDS, where on 24th of December 2019, the government laid out certain parameters and the functioning and the responsibilities of the CDS and the DMA. So one of the relevant things here is it said, bring about jointness in operation, logistics, transport, training, support services, communication, repairs and maintenance, etc. of the three services within 3 years of the first CDS assuming office. Ensure optimal utilization of infrastructure and rationalize it through jointness among the services. Basically, the jointness was laid down by the government, and the timeline was laid down that it has to be done within 3 years. So, to be fair to the CDS, if he's seeming to be hurrying up what the theaterization of the jointness structure that is being talked about within the services, I think he's going by the timelines given to him by the government, the mandate that has been given. But that's a minor point here. What I want to come back to is, if you look at the history, and Arjun, since you have sort of written books on various operations and the military conflicts that India has had, India has faced since 1947, jointness has been a rather checkered journey as far as the three services are concerned. And I'm actually showing it here that they have largely worked in silos, except for I think 1971 and later forcibly and because of the circumstances in Kargil. But your take on this, that to change the entire approach to jointness, there will have to be a mindset change and there will have to be a give and take between services. How does one achieve that is the
Yeah,
question.
Nitin, one of the points or one of the issues that I've been writing on and speaking about for a very long time is that jointness in the Indian military has been skin deep. Jointness in the Indian military has been driven by personalities and not by institutions. And that is why you see whenever there has been a spectacular display of jointmanship, it has been because of people and despite the system. For example, in 1971, when General Sagat Singh found himself on the banks of the river Meghna, he picked up the phone and called up his army commander, General Arora, and said, Jaggi, I can give you AIM Plus. I have my helicopters, I have the Air Force on board with me. Allow me to cross the river Meghna. And with great reluctance, he was allowed to cross the river Meghna using a vertical envelopment strategy, and the rest is history. But that didn't happen because it was planned by Eastern Command or by Eastern Air Command or by Army Headquarters or Air Headquarters. It was planned or it was executed because of Sagat Singh and because of Chandan Singh. So similarly, in most other conflicts, it has been individual driven, not systemically. And why is that so? That is because we have been for far too long riding on this bandwagon of saying that jointness is extremely robust in India because we train together at the National Defense Academy, at the Defense Services Staff College and the National Defense College. I'm afraid that is very, very skin deep. And I think now when we are moving towards actual integration on the ground, those chinks in our jointness are coming out into the open. And that is why I feel that jointness is not only a question of attitude and posture, but it is also a question of how well every service understands the other. And an understanding of the other service comes about through deep amount of knowledge accumulation, reading, writing, and in the intellectual domain. And I think there hasn't been enough of investment in the intellectual domain in helping India's armed forces understanding each other, because we are all so steeped in operational practices that we feel that if we push everyone together operationally, automatically you will understand each other. I'm afraid it doesn't happen that way. I think you just have to listen to some of the arguments on jointness that have emerged from people like General Mattis and the others, and they emphasize on how important it is for the intellectualization of war fighting in order to be able to cope with the nature of conflict. So now the government's mandate is absolutely the government's mandate is absolutely clear. There are two primary drivers that have propelled the need for jointness and the need for integration. The first is emerging threats, and the second is the need to develop the armed forces in an era of economic scarcity. And why do I say economic scarcity? It is because development obviously is a priority for the Prime Minister. But at the same time, without jeopardizing national security, there has to be some methodology by which you can get more bang for the buck. So that is the big picture that is driving integration and the need to cut down, say, 17 commands to a more manageable command, the need to look at threats and to recalibrate your forces in order to address threats. Because the thing is that if you have unbridled or unbridled capability at your disposal, like the United States, then you can develop your integration, which is based on capability. But when capability is limited, then you have to focus on threats. And when you focus on threats, I would like to offer a slightly contrarian view to what Admiral Srikhande says, to say that I do not have a problem with designating geographical spaces according to threats. And therefore, if the China command is focusing entirely on China, and if the Western command is focusing entirely on Pakistan, it's okay by me. If Northern command has to remain in its present state because of a still looming threat of the proxy war and insurgency, it's perfectly okay by me. If you want to call three maritime, or if you want to combine three maritime theaters into a maritime command, it's okay, because ultimately nothing much is going to change on the ground, because this maritime command will have the eastern seaboard to look after, it will have the southern seaboard, and it will have the western seaboard. Where the problem arises is, how do you ensure air power, or particularly how do you fit in the Indian Air Force into this model of integration and yet retain its effectiveness? And how do you retain the Air Force's effectiveness? By understanding what are the three distinct silos under which air power, and particularly driven by the Indian Air Force in the Indian context, runs. There are three silos. The bottommost silo is what, the bottommost ladder is what Admiral Srikhande talked about. That is the tactical component. Absolutely given that tactical actions supported by air power constitute tactical air power. But there is another very, very important dimension of air power that has emerged in the last 15 to 20 years, and those are the enabling characteristics of air power. The enabling characteristics of air power are highly specialist and specialist driven. And when I'm talking about enabling characteristics of air power, I'm talking about electronic warfare, I'm talking about aerial refueling, I'm talking about AWACS. And finally, you have the element of air power that looks at the larger domain of statecraft and missions that air power can execute independently. And when you're talking about independent air missions, I'm talking about coercion, I'm talking about deterrence, and I'm talking about strategic strikes. So this is all that, these are the three silos that need to be taken into consideration when one's looking at how air power needs to be integrated into the overall scheme of things in the present context. Now, just one last point. If a tactical action conducted by air forces in support of a small or in support of a localized surface force action, whether it is maritime or whether it is land-based, can be called tactical air power. I will say that if a special forces unit is sent in, say, about 20-25 kilometers into enemy territory to knock out an air defense radar so as to create a corridor for a deep strategic strike to take place, the Army Special Forces is supporting the Air Force. So we need to understand that all the three services are flexible in terms of their support and supporting functions. And this is where resource crunch is severely hitting the Indian Air Force, even if it wants to think about distributing its assets amongst 4 theater commands. And that is when certain basic principles of air power, which is centralized command and control, will tend to get completely dismantled. And then instead of an Air Force coming into the picture, you will have theater commanders constantly squabbling with one another for a share of air assets, which will be extremely scarce. And then again, you will have the apex command and control institution, which is driven by the CDS, who's at the head of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. So the Chiefs of Staff Committee will have hell of a problem on their hands trying best to balance the distribution of air power, because the theater commanders will be constantly scrambling for scarce assets. And therefore, one last point. Therefore, my point is that do we need to look at a structure wherein theater commanders will have access to air power based on their operational plans? But apart from raising, training, and sustaining, the Indian Air Force, in the form of whatever you call it, whether it is a central command or whether it is an aerospace theater command, you will have a mechanism by which air assets are controlled centrally and distributed according to the collective wisdom of the Chiefs of Staff Committee, which will act as the apex controlling authority, rather than distributing it into penny packets. So a typically quick structure could be that, we will come to that a little later when we have...
yes, Arjun, I think, yes, we will come back to it. But I think, the point that you are making is what Admiral Srikhande also made, that Air Force can have that central command there. But my point is a little larger. When you have not worked together, you worked in silos, I think the first thing is change of mindset for all the three services. Second, isn't it better, Admiral Srikhande, the question is to you, to have first joint planning rather than joint allocation of resources? Because without joint planning, you cannot allocate resources as and when required. So, do you think the start point for any integration should be joint planning? Joint training is there at various levels in NDA. Then you come to staff college, you come to NDC, all that is there. But those are very few in numbers. But what is your view on the fact that there should be joint planning? I mean, the chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff in the US have a different role. In our case, it will have to be a different role. But my point is about the joint planning itself. Before we start integrating, there should be joint planning. Only then you can allocate resources. What do you think?
Yes, undoubtedly, joint planning is very, very important. But joint planning and joint sort of execution, even in a decentralized manner, go hand in hand, and they've always gone hand in hand. The what gets said in the media, and sometimes I suppose behind closed doors also, is that joint planning, planning should be centralized and execution should be decentralized. But that is it's a truism. Warfare has always been like that, where joint planning has to be centralized and execution has always been decentralized, even in the army, even in the air force. The second part, what Air Marshal Subramaniam was mentioning, uh, for instance, there is a combination of threats in by which we were organized thus far. So the Air Force's Western Air Command, took countered for sort of two threats, some from China and some from Pakistan, and some other things. So there is a bit of a complexity there which we can resolve, which we can simplify. That's not a problem. The other aspect, of course, is that joint planning itself requires HQ IDS to do that, so that the service chiefs concentrate a lot more on raise, train, and sustain functions, and that joint planning with the theater CNCs, or the whatever geographic commands, whatever we want to call it, the new theaters to supersede the old theaters, uh, have to get into deep dialogue. And I agree with what was being said, and you mentioned it also, that in terms of joint training, I think nobody has got more joint training. No armed forces have had more joint training than we have had. And I would say that all this about NDA or something, fostering jointness, it has its meaning. It fosters friendships, but I agree with what Arjun was mentioning. That is not jointness. That is just good friendships, and it should not be individualized. For instance, I am ex-NDA, very proud of it, but I have not come across any non-ex-NDA officer who was any less or any more joint than an ex-NDA officer. So, and in the Navy itself today, about 8% of the Navy comes from NDA. And even when I was a cadet 40 years ago, 45 years ago, it was still about 25% at that time. So there's always a non-ex-NDA entry into the armed forces. But joint planning is very important. It is based on principles of cooperation that has to be organized much better. And I think in that case, in that sense, force planning itself is very, very important. And we have to distinguish between force planning, force structuring, and force procurement. Sometimes we use these terms interchangeably. So it is absolutely right that HQ IDS, the CDS, has been given charge of force planning, which is how to fight wars that may be upon us, or wars that we may choose to fight in decades to come, and what kind of force planning is required for that. Based on the decisions arrived from this planning for force, which is different from planning for a strategic context that might emerge. Based on that, then services in raise, train, and sustain organize force structuring with the help of HQ IDS, and then single services and the MOD, etc., do the check-off list driven, process driven work of procurement. They are not the same. So it is quite right that the government already had given the CDS responsibility for force planning, and that's a huge responsibility. So from that to joint planning in terms of the strategic context for situations that may arise is very, very important. And one couldn't emphasize it anymore.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I mean, you have worked in IDS, Admiral Shrikande, but General Dua has headed headquarter IDS and has been responsible for a lot of the jointness that existed even before DMA was created or even CDS was appointed. So, General Dua, the point that I want to ask you on is this entire debate about whether India's been late in trying to integrate, late in trying to plan for jointness. What has been the record of IDS since 2001, since it was created? Has it helped engender some of the jointness, the joint planning, the joint force structuring? What has been your experience in that position that you were in?
Nitin, before I answer your question, can I make a point on what
Please,
Arjun was discussing?
please.
This is to do with how Arjun reasoned that Air Force could be centralized because of lack of or inadequate resources. At present, they are low in number of squadrons and assets. The point I want to talk about is that if we are going to theaterize, let's stop being apologetic about the word. I mean, the point is today we are using the word theaterize. So we are clearly talking about one theater for Pakistan, one theater for China, and one theater for maritime. At least we're talking, and one the air defense, because air defense is a very complex business, and there, of course, rightly under the Air Force that has to be formed. But having said that, the thought is that the theater will be responsible, accountable and responsible for that particular terrain or adversary or both. It will have at its command all the resources that it requires to prosecute operations. Okay. Now, the idea is that it does not have to, the theater commander does not have to look over his shoulders, except for the training function. Then I'm not expanding my discussion to that.
Sure.
Except for sustaining function. And I'm not expanding my discussion to that. But as far as operations are concerned, it should be able to prosecute operations, plan for it, and be the right advice to the government. So the theater commander is responsible. So ab initio, it has the resources that it needs to take care of its operational role. If you had the resources centralized in Delhi or anywhere, and the theater commander, like Arjun was suggesting, so if you have the theater commander having to look back on his shoulder, then it somewhat, if not defeats, but dilutes the purpose of creating this integration. Having said that, his point is also very valid, and the Air Force has been saying, sounding his concerns very correctly, that our resources are less. So what is going to happen, perhaps, what we have a certain allocation ab initio, certain forces on allocation, and then eventually, depending on the threat or requirement, there will be certain forces which will be allocated on, which will be allotted. And if they have to be allotted, they obviously have to be allotted from the other theater, because we certainly do not have the luxury of having central uncommitted reserves. So the point that I am trying to make is that a theater command, an integrated theater command, has to be sort of self-contained ab initio, and that is why the theater will be able to look after that adversary or that terrain in toto, in ab initio at least. Having just made that point, I will now answer what you asked about what have we done as a country, and what role has IDS played, and or whether we were in time or not. Let me just give you a perspective that India is the last major military where we have not integrated. It is not the question of, Arjun very rightly brought out, resource optimization and our needs, etc., are very valid. But the fact remains that whether it is a developed country or a developing country, today the decision loop is the pace of war is so fast that we do need integration, even if it's the most advanced military with all the resources at its command. There are 66 countries who have integrated before India, and we've actually boarded the bus a little late. As far as IDS is concerned, well, India as a country did some real introspection only after the Kargil war. Before that, we have been sort of, if I put it bluntly, we have been papering over our lessons learned in various operations. During Kargil war, or after Kargil war, very bold steps were taken, and everyone knows, and I don't have to enumerate them. After which the headquarter IDS and other tri-service structures like SFC and ANC and some others were raised. But the government stopped short of appointing the CDS. For the last 20 years, 2 decades, that in the intervening 2 decades, the IDS has added value by adding into joint planning, by force development, by capability development, by being able to synergize the capability development between the three services. But whenever it comes to any major disagreements, IDS has not been effective because we did not have a CDS. Today there is a CDS in place. At the present moment, he's been given a charter to sort of integrate. So his energies are in raising DMA. His energies are expended in trying to integrate these structures, and it will take 3 years is the mandate given. It may slip, and the timelines may be extended if they have to be. But the fact of the matter is, he's got this charter. But thereafter, once all that is over, the CDS will be heading the headquarter IDS to be a more effective integrator between the three services and play its rightful role in integrating the three services.
No, so that's what I think. The last points from everyone I want to have in this discussion. It can go on and on, but the point that is being made here, I think worldwide, people are looking at how India is going to integrate, how the theatres are going to evolve, the theatre commands are going to evolve. But if you look at the examples of just the two countries, the United States and the British model, I think the jointness was thrust upon top down. So inevitably there will be some, heart. I mean, there'll be a lot of heartburn somewhere. There'll be resentment in some service. But remember, in the US, the man who actually broke ranks with the other services was an Air Force guy. Just to remind everyone, General David Jones, who wanted the entire restructuring and jointness to come in quickly. So my question to all of you, one common question is, if the services don't agree, and if the government forces it, how will it pan out? I mean, when the government steps in, then the services will have to accept it and then make the best use of the circumstances. To you, Arjun Subramaniam first, and then to the rest others.
Yeah, Nitin, taking off from your question, that what if it is an inevitability? What if theaterization in its current trajectory is inevitable? Well, I have two ideas. The first, and let me state upfront over here, that these views are entirely my own, because neither have I been part of any formal or informal consultative committees about this entire process of theaterization. So actually, I have been completely on the outside, and therefore these views entirely are mine and have to be taken in the correct context. The first is when it comes to leadership. If theaterization is inevitable, why is it that the Air Force cannot understand operations either on the Western or the Northern front? So what that means is, why can't the Air Force also be part of leading either Western Command or Northern Command in rotation with the Indian Army? Number two, if not both, at least one. The second is, if one looks at now this is an issue keeping service leadership, tough, equality, and those kind of issues in mind. But if I were to look at it from an air power perspective and the centrality of air power, the problems of command and control, scarcity, and the other issues, I have another option to say that why does one not create an aerospace theater? And in that aerospace theater, you have 4 verticals. You have a strike vertical, you have an air transport vertical, you have a space vertical, and you have an air defense vertical. So you have 3 verticals that are directly led by the Indian Air Force, and the 4th vertical, which is space, obviously is going to be a tri-service vertical. And this vertical will then be charged with ensuring that the requirements of the theater commanders are met through a process of centralized.
I think electricity is cut. So, Admiral Shrikande, in the meantime, your views on this. The government is determined to get the joint commands going. So, what is the option for the services? They'll have to go through this.
I think it is both ways. It's not only the government that is determined, but I think the services are also on board. Nobody is rebelling against the very idea of jointness or the need for integration. That will happen. It is. We shouldn't even use the word inevitable because it's been decided. So it is going to happen. The second aspect is one of resources. I would say that we have to consider a few things. One is that there will never be adequate resources in most cases. There never have been, perhaps, and therefore sharing of resources is something that we always have done through what the army calls attachments and detachments. The navy calls change of operational command, that is chopped from one to the other. This is something that has happened, and let's not forget that the central command of the US perhaps is the smallest force holder of all other commands, and yet central command has been the one that has been engaged for the last 20 years in two wars which haven't haven't terminated that
The
well.
US
But
way, yeah.
nonetheless, yes, most of the forces it uses for air power, for army units, marines, as well as naval units are from the other commands of the United States, and that is how most wars are fought, and 71 was also fought that way. Whenever India is mobilized, we've done that. So holding of assets is far less important than fielding assets. This is something that I have written about in those three articles. We need to be quite we need to look at it a little differently. The second aspect, therefore, I would suggest is that even if the Air Force goes up to 40 squadrons, I think the centrality of using much of the Air Force that way. Whereas I have also recommended that some squadrons obviously will be assigned to theaters. Not everything the Air Force has can swing, and
Exactly.
it is not everything can swing, because you will be required so deeply committed to that there is no scope in a 24-hour or a 48-hour or a 72-hour operational cycle to swing to anything else. So the Air Force needs more assets. But even if it were to get more assets, I think what it can assign to some of the other commands that are shaping up uh, could also be swung whenever required to the others. So the indivisibility of air power is very important. But as I have said, there's no point in overstating that case. There's also
Yeah,
no point in anybody overstating the case that holding assets is not the same as command and control of assets.
I
So
agree.
that is something that again each service has to think differently. And I don't know why the army sort of keeps talking about this holding of assets, because they have also operated on attachments and detachments. So I think there are no major issues here. There is some give and take that always has happened and will continue to happen. And to use an old phrase. I would say that jointness can never be perfect. Perfection cannot be defined, but it has to be sufficiently
Functional.
effective
Yeah, it
and
has to
and
be functional.
functional. Yes, it can never be perfect. There is no such thing, but it should be sufficiently effective, and I think that is the way to go.
Absolutely true in that sense. General Dua, last word to you. The way forward, and is it inevitable, or is it the need of the hour, or is it something that will happen as a natural process because the government has already given the mandate? Jointness, integration, theaterization.
Uh, well, it is happening. There is no doubt. The orders have been issued. We all continue to discuss this. It's a national discourse, and rightly so, because it's an important issue. However, the services are going ahead to a plan, and like we all discussed earlier, that it is good that this churning, these differences are coming up now, because they will help us evolve the structures. And not only that, this is the not the last time we will have disagreements. This will continue. But the fact also remains that it's a given. There is no question. I don't know. There's no word like inevitable. It has already been given. The orders have been given. It's in process. The timelines may be met or may slip. Is a matter of time. And I think I am very hopeful. The thing is going to process of integration is going to start, and it is going to be good for a country.
I think so. I think we are running out of time, so I will not belabor the point. But let me just, as an aside, since much has been talked about the apprehensions of the Air Force vis-a-vis allocation of assets, there is also the apprehension which nobody talks about of the Army Air Defense. I've been, getting inputs from Army Air Defense officers and people who man Army Air Defense saying that how will we integrate with the Air Force if the integrated air defense comes in. So, there are so many aspects to this debate, but we'll leave it for some other day. I just want to thank all of you for being here and being so candid about what is right now a very hot topic, at least in the military circles, if not elsewhere or across the country. I think we'll have more occasions to discuss this and take it forward. But for the moment, thank you very much for joining and sparing your time, almost an hour that we have discussed this. Thank you very much and good night.
Thank you, Nitin.
Thank you.
Jai Hind.
Thanks, Nitin. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, viewers, do keep sending we had a lot of live comments coming in. We couldn't take questions really because this was a very intense discussion. We will take comments as and when we do it again. This kind of a discussion, but don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you have come for the first time on this channel. Keep sending comments, keep sending feedback, and of course, do follow our social media handles. They're all there. They're on Twitter, there's Instagram, there is Facebook, and there is, of course, our website. So for the moment, it's goodbye, but do join us and do keep watching Stat News Global. Good night.